And to our last speaker, thank you so much for your patience, Kevin. Kevin Page is, as a geoscience and geodiversity specialist, Kevin Page's experience is very broad, but focuses on two key themes. Firstly, his core geoscience research field is in paleontology and stratigraphy, in particular concerning global ammonite taxonomy, high resolution biochronology and palaeobiogeography, especially of the Jurassic System. In addition, however, he is also a leading specialist, a practitioner and consultant in aspects of geodiversity and geoheritage, including environmental interpretation and education. And I want to thank Kevin very profusely for stepping in at the last minute, because I had realised in organising all of this that it was very live thing heavy, and then I was like, oh God.
Yes.
No, geology, no, oh gosh. And I know that obviously the GCG are, excellent, and they obviously provide a huge amount of support, but NatSCA does also, encompass our stony friends. And so I thought, so thank you so much for stepping up and offering your expertise. So without further ado, Kevin.
Okay, paleontological heritage and the law. Actually, a lot of the talks were about dead things anyway, but these are long dead things. One thing which Laura didn't mention, I'm now president of ProGeo, which is the Association for the Conservation of the Geological Heritage. It's a global organisation, and we work with partners, all sorts of organisations across the planet on aspects of paleontological, of aspects of geological conservation generally. So I'm also editor-in-chief of Geoheritage, which is the sort of leading journal in the field, and there's lots and lots of stuff about museum subjects within it. So what I get, the actual legal situation for fossils is, on the one hand, quite simple, and on the other hand, sort of quite complicated. But it basically revolves around a few basic principles. So I'll sort of introduce some of those there. So this talk is more about perhaps principles than necessarily some of the detail, because every single country, even every site almost, has a slightly different perspective. So anyway, considerations of geological heritage conservation and related legal issues are fundamental to both the initial collection and the subsequent acquisition of geological specimens by an institution as a resource for future generations, not least as there can obviously be legal consequences for all involved if they are ignored. Ideally, the conservation measures in place should be beneficial to science and heritage custodianship by ensuring that both key source localities remain available for study, preventing loss and damage, as well as ensuring that key specimens of scientific and heritage importance are deposited in appropriate institutions for scientific study and safeguard for the future, obviously. This is not always the case, however, as highly restrictive measures in some places can virtually prevent all continued study, as well as it making it almost impossible for all but a very small number of local and national institutions to legally hold material from those sites.
Have you changed your front slide yet?
No, yeah, this slide, that's okay. I'll close my contribution down here. Okay, the reasons for the restrictive measures often stem from a confusion with the highly protective regimes required for living species conservation and a misunderstanding of the needs of the geosciences, which virtually always require some form of sampling. In many cases, such restrictions also represent attempts by national and regional agencies to safeguard a national heritage which had historically been plundered or otherwise damaged through misuse. However, more insidiously, they could also reflect attempts by individual politically influenced scientists or institutions to control a resource for their own exclusive use. And this can take place at all levels from regional to national. And in few cases, however, the motivation is altogether darker. And it's an unfortunate fact that the paleontological resource can be economically controlled by oppressive regimes or criminal activity. Next, please. So, but whatever the on-site, regional or national legal framework is, 3 bits of information are needed before any acquisition should be considered, as one must always assume that the fossils belong to someone. This can be a private individual, a commercial company, a local community, or a local, regional, or national government organization, or even the state itself. It is also highly likely that national, local or regional conservation regulations and legal controls are also in place. That's on the site itself. The latter may also include restrictions on the movement of specimens, for instance, concerning export, and not just internationally, as this can even be interregionally within the same country. Next, please. So I've got 2 scenarios here, which I'm always present up because they represent 2 sort of extremes in the approach to conserving paleontological heritage. From the Jurassic World Heritage Site, because it's in Dorset, in England, and in the autonomous community of Aragon in Spain, where everything is protected. Next, please. So in the Dorset and East Devon World Heritage Site, there is effectively no protection for fossils. It's an open coastline with no locally significant erosion, and this is sort of one of the excuses used for this. So rather control collecting and commercial exploitation, a voluntary code ensures that fossils are given to the collector if reported, but many remain unrecorded due to emissions. Now, these reported fossils can be sold openly, but I think the figure still 6 months is allowed for the UK museums to raise a competitive price, which is basically a global marketplace. As a result, and not surprisingly, there's been a massive development of commercial collecting in the area, including trading online. And you can see at the bottom there, typical fossil shop in the area, a fossil collector promoted in a document from the World Heritage Group, and one of the ammonites on sale. And these are the things I try to study. And with a £2.5 price tag, it's becoming increasingly difficult to do the science. Next, please. So, okay, the first question is, does this work in terms of conserving the heritage, which was the argument? Well, I worked on a bypass site a few years ago and did a simple calculation using the number of vertebrate fossils or reptiles as a sort of indicator, as the number of specimens one would expect to have been reported as being scientifically important on the coast. It's a simple multiplier, this, because the reptiles are well recorded, because they are the most valuable commercially. So I estimated in the first 3 years of this code, which has been now working for more than 20 years, at least 1,200 key specimens of actual potential scientific interest would have been collected and disposed of, lost, sold. And after 20 years, you can imagine 20,000, 30,000 specimens from what is supposed to be one of the most important paleontological sites in the country. So a question comes from this. In this particular case, the specimens are being collected, they're being sold, they're being offered to institutions, but actually behind all of this, even if it's legal, is it actually ethical? Because for other UNESCO sites, such as global sites, the situation is very different, and the World Heritage Site in Dorset is very much an outlier. UNESCO states that the management body for a geopark must not participate directly in the sale of geological objects such as fossils, minerals, polished rocks, and ornamental rocks of the type normally found in so-called rock shops within the UNESCO geopark, regardless of their origin. So it's not just from the area, it's from other areas, and should actively discourage unsustainable trade in geological materials as a whole. So we have a situation here where there might be a legal aspect and things can be offered for sold. And I'm sure many people who have geological collections have been offered things from Dorset. But in the broader scheme of things, is this actually ethical? And I'll come back to this point again. Oh, next one. Okay. So this is the sort of thing one sees in Dorset, and there's mixed messages. The bottom newspaper headline obviously indicates why there's so much local support for the World Heritage Site, because he was believed to represent a big input in tourism. But here you have a World Heritage Site information centre with a shop below offering to hire you hammers to go and hammer the World Heritage Site with some large blocks of rock from around the area, and I'll come back to this one as well. So there are mixed messages here, which have caused an issue. Next one, please. We've been feeling this issue elsewhere in Britain, especially. Although many of us, I mean, I spent 11 years working for English Nature, and I still do work within the broader scheme of the conservation agencies. We were trying to promote the conservation and respect for geological heritage, but we have a intense focus in Dorset, which is really giving the wrong impression elsewhere. So you can see some collectors here digging out a privately owned site on the Somerset coast near Watchet, and the bottom right picture shows the damage. They have strip mined a level there with particular fossils and vertebrates within it. So the Dorset collectors and the attitude transfers someone else, and this site is being destroyed. You can see some of the fossils on the right hand side, which are actually were in sale in the fossil shop below the Heritage Centre in Dorset. And they are technically stolen from the landowner there, who is very happy about this. Next one, please. And this is another example. This is a very important early dinosaur footprint site in South Wales, Bendrick Rocks, where an area of about 30 square meters of footprints were dug out and sold. And the top left is another fossil shop in Lyme Regis where some of these specimens ended up. The material is now in the National Museum of Wales, fortunately, and I think they're still ongoing to try and recover some of this. But in the Welsh situation, this is taken very seriously, and you can see in the bottom right a Welsh policeman looking into the problem. Next one, please. In Scotland, however, things are very different. To a certain extent, it represents Scottish law, where not only things in situ in the land, but also movables belong to the landowner. Now, years ago, Scotland had some very bad experiences. It was held to ransom for an early reptile find, which was unfortunately dug out with the support of a museum from a site near Glasgow. The people of Scotland ended up having to pay £180,000 to get back a 15 centimetre specimen from land which was actually publicly owned. Scotland has suffered from gangs coming in, not just from Europe, but also from England and indeed in Scotland, raiding sites. So the middle on the left represents a locality which has been raided many times, important for early vertebrates, and the material was sold to a museum in Germany, and literally Scottish Natural Heritage were knocking on the doors of the museum trying to get the specimens back. What has been done subsequently in Scotland is something very, very innovative. There's been a set up a fossil collecting code with all sorts of guidelines of what is responsible and what is not, which is actually supported by legislation. This is more than just voluntary guidance, and this code is now just being re-released, and it's a very good way of going through that delicate balance between people being interested in wanting to collect a few fossils, amateurs for instance, and actual legal protection. So it's a very, very good model. So Scotland, because of the attitudes there, is trying to resolve some of the problems and place in nature conservation orders and restrictions to try and safeguard its heritage, something which is unfortunately not generally happening across most of England, but in Wales there is the attitude is a bit different also. Next one, please. So far, we tend to rely in England on a whole series of basic voluntary codes of conduct. These are very good as a framework for advice. and they could be as useful to a curator in the museum, indeed, as anyone else, because they go through what is actually acceptable and what isn't, with lots and lots of advice and guidance. And these sorts of things we could really do with a new edition of Hint, to actually provide and educate people. If they're offering a fossil, do they know about its provenance, the legalities behind it as well, similar to the discussion over CITES specimens. So in the absence of actual sort of clear regulations and things, the voluntary this sort of guidance is very important. Next, please. And I won't say which institution this is, and I hasten to add, this shop is not controlled or any way part of a museum. The problem is this whole of this attitude about sort of geological specimens as just being things to trade. It is actually sort of perpetrated still by some of the sort of within institutions and museums. The shop is often independent of the rest, or semi-independent. And this was just a brief snapshot of a few things which I saw in such a shop last month. So top left are some ammonites from Scunthorpe. There are no active excavations there, so those almost certainly came from the SSSI, the protected site. The middle one looks very much like a specimen from Berwick Bay in Scotland, where Scottish Natural Heritage took out a nature conservation order because of years of destruction by the commercial trade. The right-hand picture shows a range of specimens, a lot from Scotland, and it's highly likely those are from protected sites because there aren't any lead mines in the area now. They could be historical specimens. They may or may not tick the pre-1947 box, but they are specimens which may have come from protected sites. Bottom left, a series of ammonites, probably Morocco, probably Madagascar. Those countries do have legislations, they do have geoparks. The fish below, if they came from Wyoming, there are both legal quarries and illegal quarries around the Fossil Bluff National Monument. And some of those things have been found being smuggled around in barrels with drugs and firearms. On the bottom right, Minas Gerais in Brazil, those may or may not be legally collected, but Brazil has very strong regulations since the 1940s. And many museums now just refuse to touch anything from Brazil because it is, a lot of it, or most of it, has come out illegally. Next one, please. Now, the other scenario is the autonomous community of Aragon in Spain, where the Spanish constitution requires that legislation is passed to have regard for historical heritage. That includes paleontology. It's often grouped within that. Sometimes often confused with archaeology as well. Every region in Spain has developed its own laws, and there's a complex relationship between site designation and protection systems, that basically all fossils are protected, and to get a permission to sample is effectively a legal declaration of the local government. It's basically issued in their legal documents. Next, please. Now, this sort of blanket production creates all sorts of dilemmas. There's a small boy here, he's now grown up, looking at some fossils in his family's land. He's not allowed to collect them as fossils, but his cousins could remove that outcrop and build a wall with it. The other locality, very important Jurassic locality, he's just picked up and is very excited to find a small piece of ammonite, very worn, but there's only one institution in the planet it's allowed to go to, which is the university in Tharotha. Anything else is technically illegal. Therefore, the only fate for that fossil, which is obviously potentially very useful for education, is to be thrown away because it's not good enough to go in a museum. So you have a dilemma there of important specimens lying around and even things which aren't so important, but not being able to be used. Next, please. Whereas if you have a permission to run a quarry, or in this top pictures, build a ski station, you can destroy these fossils every day, and it's not legally possible to actually collect them and save them. So this is another ethical dilemma. What do you do under these circumstances? So once you've collected the fossil, for instance, this group on the bottom left are quite legally collecting trilobites at a locality in the area, but they can collect them, but they can't take them away. So you can break up the rock, leave them exposed, so they weather away. The bottom right is a large cystid echinoderm, unique specimen, and it's not allowed to collect that. It will just sit and rot away because the legal situation dictates that. So you have between a Dorset situation where there is some no protection, which creates its own ethical issues, and here you have complete protection or complete regulation with a different set of ethical issues, and these are sorts of things which museums and other institutions have to think about. Next one, please. And this is a situation in Spain. This is from a paper in Geoheritage. It's a review of the legal situations in Spain. Now, Aragon is the strongest, but if you see on the right there, that is a list of the autonomous communities in Spain and all the different laws each one has. So there's some general national law about not exporting heritage, but within each community there's a different law. The Aragonese one is the most extreme, and it unfortunately stems from a trilobite specialist trying to control the entire paleontological resource of the community for his own ends. He's retired now, but we're still living with the consequences of that. But every area is different, so it depends where you are in Spain what applies in terms of protection, what is allowed and what isn't. And this is quite similar for quite a few countries. I believe the situation is very similar in Germany now. You need to know specifically which region the specimen came from, the regional legislation as well as the national legislation, before one can actually consider whether this specimen is as legally obtained or not. Next, please. But there is one bottom line here. There's two sort of collections here, piled up specimens. The top one in Spain is in the university. It's documentation. It's all stored for funding when it can be accessioned. And because it's collected with permissions through a strong heritage system, it's protected as a collection. This is an English situation, material and private storage, which does require some documentation put together, but no museum will accept it pending that, or it's unlikely to accept it depending that, and there's no protection for that collection, which could be lost as it deteriorates under substandard storage. I hasten to add that the storage is very much improved now. So there is this sort of thing. It affects all levels. Because the heritage is protected in Spain, then funding can be found at different levels up to museum level to actually sort of store it. And the lovely roller racking in the top photographs was paid for by the government of Aragon to put this material in a better storage. Okay, it might still be in shirt boxes and things like that, and shoe boxes, but it's there sitting until the funding is available and the project is available to carry out the next stage. Next, please. And there's a whole other category of fossils. One best calls them blood fossils, like blood diamonds. The top is a letter from the Society of Vertebrate Paleontologists about this particular issue, Burmese amber, as it's called, obviously from Myanmar. It's been collected and sold to benefit the regime in that country, and I think most of us will know what that actually means in terms. It's all been on the news recently. But if you go online, top right, you can find lots of it on sale in all sorts of beautiful patterns. But unfortunately, people are still publishing on this. They are buying material, obtaining material, which I'm not joking, literally people are dying because of the activities which effectively they are indirectly funding. And on sort of your search on Google, it actually says buying amber could potentially fund an ethnic civil war. But then there's the classic line put in afterwards, but through feigning allows collectors to acquire important specimens. So actually, this is a serious ethical question. What's more important, saving acquisition, sort of curating a scientifically important specimen, or any considerations of human life? Next one. And these issues are beginning to be taken very, very seriously indeed. And top left is an old sort of article about dodgy fossils, museums, ethics and science. The discussion is obviously out there. But something which is important now, publishers are beginning to make statements about research involving geological and paleontological materials, that it must be collected legally, all the sorts of things which you should be thinking about in museums. And even an issue which is important now about the exploitation of low and middle income countries by high income countries who can afford to buy the stuff, which should ideally go into their museums. And with wars going on all over the place, there's a series of other ethicals as well. Now, the bottom stuff is about what happens if you try to do something with material from a country where there are restrictions involved. If you look on the left, an important description of a new species of dinosaur, Elsevier was forced to withdraw it because a specimen had removed from Brazil illegally. Unfortunately, where it ended up, I think the institution is refusing to return it, which is a big ethical question in its first right. And you see on the right, this is one of 998 specimens stolen from a geopark in Brazil, which are now being returned to Brazil. So it's not exactly a CITES, but some countries are very active about this and they will pursue things. Next, please. And this is a very important, well, basically sort of like Portuguese, Spanish, Italian paper recently, the whole principle of palaeontoethics. I do recommend looking at this one. You might not necessarily agree with it, but it's all about the ethics of collecting and research and exploitation and legal considerations, which are, and there was even within the International Union of Geological Sciences, there's now a commission specifically on geoethics. So geologists are finally beginning to think about this, but this needs to be transferred at all other levels. Next, please. And there are international initiatives developing. There's the 1970 UNESCO Convention on illicit import, export and transfer of ownership of cultural property. And once you collect a fossil, it is effectively cultural heritage as well. It's got a natural origins, but it's cultural because it's been collected because of its significance to human culture, which could be science or something else. It's rarely invoked, but it's been sitting there for a long time, providing the background. Now within ProGeo, we've been working with IUCN, developing a series of motions for IUCN to adopt concerning geological heritage. And the one at the bottom for 2016 is on movable geological heritage. IUCN basically sets the guidelines for nature conservation legislation for signatory countries. So if IUCN are supporting this, the implication is that all countries will take steps to implement legislation to not only protect their own heritage, but also the sort of trade from other countries. So it's a sort of like a sort of CITES things, but in this case, relying on national legislation. One would hope at some point that sort of UNESCO might take something like this in board, and we're still certainly working within ProGeo to raise awareness and develop this. And the important thing is this is a global heritage, and it requires a globally informed framework for its sustainable management. Next, please. And what we've also tried to do is establish some general principles to guide decision makers. Not every fossil requires protection. It's just like plants and animals. You can shoot some and eat them, like pheasants, and berries and certain species of mushrooms, but there are others like eagles and tigers which deserve a higher level of protection. People understand that, governments understand it for living species, and but so there's no reason why they shouldn't understand it for fossil, but we do need education. Now, a few years ago, within one of the working groups I'm involved in with on the stratigraphic side, in 2002. Next one, please. We produced this sort of categorization of important specimens, and something like this could actually be potentially useful in looking at any institutional collection. But the most important, including by international codes, are the type specimens, the representatives of the type specimen of a species, a nominal species. And the figured and cited specimens are part of that. So these are the ones which do require a higher level of protection in institutions. And many now are moving their type and figured specimens to special secure cabinet areas. There's another category which haven't been described yet, which are unique or rare. And these are the ones which very much institutions should be aiming to acquire and safeguard, because they are the raw material of science and heritage. There's also a category of specimens which are relevant, they're interesting for education, but they're not necessarily unique. And these are some of the specimens which could potentially be exchanged. I don't like the idea of fossil trade, that's sort of, but with some of these specimens like this one here on the right, which will be sold as a paving slab in Croatia, it's actually a resting trace of a starfish. It's not the end of the world if that happens. And category 4 are things which just don't need protection at all. They're abundant, they're rock forming. So with all this complex legislation, there are some fossils which just don't need protecting, and these can be incredibly useful for education and public awareness, because by collecting and looking at these, you're not killing anything. Next, please. So, concluding remarks. I've got still a few minutes left. There's a few basic questions which you need to ask if you're being offered a fossil, especially if you're being asked to pay for a fossil. Who does it actually belong to is the first important question. It could actually be the person offering the fossil if they obtained it legally, but if they haven't, it might still be the owner of the source locality, actually sometimes even if they have obtained it legally. And that could be an individual, a community, a company, or a local, regional, or national government. So who does it belong to, and has that person actually got the right to offer it to you? Do they actually have title? Beyond the actual ownership of the specimen, there's a whole raft of legislation, irrespective of the actual ownership, which is to do with conservation legislations. Are there any conservation regulations and legal controls which apply to the source locality, and has the specimen been collected in accordance with such regulations and any related conditions, such as blanket permissions? In Britain, if you want to collect a fossil from a protected site, you have to get 2 bits of information, usually. One is the permission of the landowner, and second is a consent from the Nature Conservation Agency if it's a protected site within certain categories. You can't do it with only one of those. If you take it with the conservation permission but not the landowner, it's theft. If you take it with the landowner's permission but not the conservation things, then the landowner could be charged with not protecting the site. That's the way, unfortunately, it works, or the way it works. Also, is a very important question: has a specimen legally removed from a region or country? Sometimes you can collect it, but you can't move it around. And there may be applicable regional, national, and international heritage legislation. In Brazil, with a fossil fish, for instance, the material cannot be removed beyond a certain province in Brazil. And unfortunately, because things have historically gone to other parts of Brazil, things have got very nasty, with even scientific colleagues in some parts of Brazil having police raids by the police being informed from other parts of Brazil that they might have some illegally collected specimens. So these things can get get quite nasty indeed when there is a lot of vested local interest. Well, this is a matter of record, of course. There's also the other level. If you've worked out the title of the fossil, you know it's been collected within the framework of conservation legislations. None were infringed or they've been permitted. It's been moved around legally. But are there any ethical considerations as well? If you're buying material from certain areas, are you actually supporting the damage to a protected site and the loss of the heritage? It doesn't really matter whether it's technically illegal or not. By buying the specimen in particular, you might actually be supporting levels of damage. And in certain countries, you might be supporting oppressive regimes and organized criminal activity. I'm not saying that necessarily removing the fossils as part of the criminal activity. I mean, that might not actually have been illegal at that point, but the exportation might have been. There's also this very, very important issue we all need to be careful of these days, is this whole thing of neo-colonization, where high-income countries can effectively buy off the heritage of low to middle income countries, and that deprives people in those countries not only of their heritage but of also something for them to study and work on. And unfortunately this is still very, very common. And there's also the conservation of established regional, national, international guidelines, agreements and conventions, not necessarily legal controls but principles established. So three things: who owns the site, were there any conservation regulations, is movement permitted, are there any associated ethical considerations? So actually it's as simple as that. Every country has its own situation, so these, depending when the material is from, you need to be able to answer these questions. And an important consideration, a comprehensive transfer of title statement is needed, but how can you make sure the declarations being made are true? And so, armed with a little bit of background knowledge about possible sources and things like that, it is possible to ask quietly some questions. And next one, and the final one. These are a few key sources about the subject. I wrote a fairly comprehensive paper which was published in 2018, which discussed through some of the philosophies of paleontological heritage and its conservation. As you've probably seen, it's not necessarily clearly defined from one place to another. And within the journal, I edit for ProGeo. So this is actually a journal for a global geoconservation organization. We have regular articles on case histories and studies, and there's quite a lot about Brazil in there, for instance, and a lot about Spain as well. Spain has done some really great things in the field of conserving fossils, but essentially the Spanish fossils by law should all be in Spain. So there are considerations like that. So that's all I've got to say for now. I'm sure there are plenty of things I haven't covered, and I'm sort of delighted to take some questions.
Wow, that was a huge that was such a huge topic. And also I have come across several of the things that you've raised myself.
Yeah.
Where I used to work in Warwick, the thing that you mentioned about often being disconnected to the, so something got brought into the shop, I can't remember what it was, and then our curator, John Radley, who perhaps you know.
I know John, yes. Hi, John.
Yeah, yeah. He sort of went in and was like, I've just walked through the shop. What's this? And and he was really hot on sort of saying, it's absolutely not acceptable for us to sell this. We need, this needs to go. But also for archaeological things, quite often people will bring things in and be like, oh, look at these, and yeah, but where did you get that?
Yes.
It's a free for all. So we did have a few comments while you were talking. So Lindsay Swift says she used to work on the Jurassic coast. We'd often get asked by visitors, can we keep what we find? Our answer was always yes, but if you find anything amazing, please come back and tell us because it might be scientifically important. plenty of people did, but it does make you wonder how many important specimens are just lost to science because people just don't report their finds. But she did say, just to clarify, the fossil shop has nothing to do with the Heritage Centre. It's a
I know,
separate
yes.
business.
I should have made that quite clear. It's quite separate. It's
Yeah.
it's the co-location, which is the
Yes.
no, I do. I'm sorry if I was misleading on that one.
Yeah,
No,
no, but yeah, people, even if you state it, people will conflate the two, won't they? Just because they're right next to each other.
It's a very,
Um,
I mean, this whole issue. I mean,
Elizabeth,
it's sorry. I say about Dorset. I mean, it's what is needed is more people to communicate with people in Dorset the importance of things and get that sort of exchange and things going, because people are finding really important things and really unique things, and they don't know about it, or I guess lost somewhere. And it's that level of education which is needed, and that sort of development of the link between people on site in the institution. And if it's picked up on Luce and Dorset, where there's an open permission, it's not a problem. If it's dug out of the surface, then it does actually belong to someone. So that goes into whole different sorts of things.
yeah.
So yes.
Elizabeth says, great talk, really interesting. I realise that this could be a huge a misunderstanding, and I would likely be fraught with challenges, but would it be worthwhile considering if CITES could add geological paleontological material, given that it already has a structure of some sort?
I don't see why not, actually, because it's all biologically related. And I was thinking about it earlier, actually. The sorts of principles, which I was really fascinating talk on CITES, and I'm certainly going to get back to Nicola on that one. It's there's a lot of parallels in there in listing categories and having quite clear principles as what, if it's going to be exported or imported, does it need to be investigated and checked as regards its source? So yeah, no, a CITES-like system would work very well for paleontology. Other parts of geology, minerals and things, is something different because they can be an economic resource. But for fossils, it should actually work well, actually.
Somebody was saying, would it be possible to access the recordings? And so yes, just to reiterate to everyone, we are recording the talks and we're going to be sending out access to the talks. Everyone very kindly gave their permission for us to do that. So yes, I think a lot of people have been asking, oh, I've missed this. It just seemed to me like what a wild west you guys have, like
literally
yeah. Very very tricky.
Yeah, it gets mixed up between archaeology and ecology and things, so it is actually a mess. It really is.
Yeah, I had I've had a sort of similar tricky situation. We had a fossil fish on display that was on loan, and the lady very specifically said, no, I'm not giving it to you, it's going to remain on loan. And but she was she just made the loan situation really difficult. But of course, we're all probably aware here of how difficult loans can be, long-term loans. You don't want things to be, somebody dies and then you're stuck in this weird limbo. But of course, when something's on loan, it can't be studied, it can't be researched, because it has to belong to a public institution.
Yes, absolutely.
For that scientific and so it was just kind of in this weird limbo, and it had been imaged and shared with researchers of this kind of fossil to say this is significant, it may even be a type. But she just wouldn't relinquish the material at all. So anyway, but because we're on the Isle of Man and we have quite strict protections, we were able to do what you said of saying, well, if you want that specimen back, that's fine, but it's not allowed to leave the country because it is a protected asset. So hopefully in the future we will get it back. But yeah, these things, she could have said, oh no, I'm just going to send it off and it's just going to disappear. But for us, we have not got a particularly rich fossil heritage. We don't have dinosaurs, things like that. So that is such an important thing for us, and it could possibly even be the first type that we have
And it
for
was
the
actually
islands.
from the island, was it?
Yes, yeah, it was found
Oh,
here.
wow.
From I think it was from the Poolvash Quarry, which is like a
Okay.
yeah.
Oh,
So,
wow.
but anyway,
That is
it's
special.
like a ratfish, sort of type
Ah,
thing. But yes. So, Rachel Webster, some of the fossil protection measures reminded me of protected plants, which you can't pick or dig up to move, but as part of a lawn can be mown down. So, like,
yes.
God, And
Yes, I
apologies.
know.
Just
It
being
gets
like,
silly
oh, this
sometimes.
is a nightmare, It's yeah, absolute nightmare. And she says apologies to whoever sent her a message about cabinets. Her Wi-Fi went off and she lost the meeting chat. So whoever that was, please do message her again. So thank you, Kevin.
Pleasure.
We've overrun a little bit of this session, but as we don't have the final session, because Amalia isn't available, hopefully you'll give me license to overrun a bit and just say a quick conclusions and a sort of a breakdown of the day, just to kind of as a wind up, and to also thank all the participants. Alan Payton's talk at the very start of the day, really set home, the planning ahead that you need to do for CITES and with plant material, and also gave some great detail about the Nagoya protocols and the triggers and needing licensing. And it's certainly something that I didn't know a huge amount about, because I haven't dealt with a lot of international collections. Michelle was great with the Human Tissue Authority and the advice and guidance, particularly what I found interesting about like the sensitive incineration. So, dealing with human remains later. What would you do? How would you deal with things if you have unnamed, specimens or things within your collection? Amy's practical guide and warnings for loans was fantastic, and I loved seeing all of those sort of real life experiences that she could give us images from, and what not to do as well, in terms of like making sure that you haven't got your energy saving light bulbs like turning off in the middle of dealing with the type, nightmare. But well done for finding it, even if it did take you 3 days. So Rachel, poisons, fantastically interesting. I mean, I think old people always do find those kinds of not gruesome but sort of fascinating things really interesting, and especially about all the labeling, and also labeling allergens, which I hadn't thought of. But yes, if you did have something like peanuts in your collection and you have somebody coming in that's got a peanut allergy, I mean, nightmare scenario. So that was a super important tip, thank you. And also I really do have to dig out that ergot specimen, because I'm like, oh god. So Nicola Burnett, thank you for coming to talk to us about like the animal side of CITES and the Wildlife and Countryside Act, Brexit implications, and another kind of like, oh god, like another layer of things for us to start to think about. But also for me as well, just kind of straightening out the sources of the nomenclature for things like the differences between appendices and appendixes, because I did kind of conflate those in my brain, and I don't have to deal with CITES too often myself, but sometimes it did kind of like there was a crossover, but it's good to know why, how they're different and where that comes from. And then of course, Kevin, thank you so much. And going through those ethics and the mixed messaging, highlighting like watching shop stock, and just the nightmare that you must have trying to keep on top of all of this, and trying to forward the legislation and the management of geological resources, because it's a finite resource, and once they're gone, like with all of our specimens and collections. So and we really do need to start paying more attention to that kind of thing. Yeah, so what was that, Glenn? Was that you, Glenn? No, who was that? So yeah, so anyway, if any, hopefully there's no other questions, but if there are, please do feel to drop them through to NatSCA. We're more than happy to pass anything on. Thank you to all of our speakers again. And yeah, we will pick up on, oh, and I'd like to say that there were a few people that and sort of sessions that we did try to get on, but for various reasons and people's schedules, they won't be able to make it. But we're hoping to perhaps do that training as separate shorter seminars or something later on in the day. So things like copyright legislation, which Amalia was going to be doing later today, which you know, we all have to deal with, and we do think is really important. So perhaps she's going to do a lunchtime chat in the new year. And also Douglas Russell from the NHM regarding eggs, because many of us do also deal with eggs, and we all know the nightmare that can be taken with those. So yeah, so watch this space. If any of you do have any suggestions for future training that you'd like us to do, because you know NatSCA, you know, we're here to serve you, the natural sciences collections community. You know, we all have to deal with some weird stuff. And we often, especially if we've had reductions in staff or we've been bunged in sort of looking after something that we've got no expertise in, you know, prior to that, you know, it's often a very steep learning curve. And so NatSCA is here to help. Always ask us questions, because even if I won't know, or you know, others won't know the answers ourselves, we know the experts to ask. So and we are here to help you, because as we know, all the things that we look after are very precious. So thank you very much, everybody. You get out of school early.